Okay, I will call this informational meeting on November 22nd, Tuesday, November 22nd to order. And I'd like to first welcome back our colleagues that were traveling to Pittsburgh last week and to the National League of Cities Conference. And we look forward to your presentations. As I understand, it will be the second meeting of December. So we look forward to hearing about your experiences in Pittsburgh. First up is the Audit Committee, and last Tuesday, Monday of last week, November 14th, we convened and then immediately went into executive session and adjourned following the executive session. That brings us to the next topic, open discussion. Any open discussion this afternoon? Okay, seeing none, then we'll move right into our presentations. And the first presentation is the October Financial Report by Tracy Turbach, Director of Finance. Welcome, Tracy.
Good afternoon, Councilors. Tracy Turbach with the Finance Office. It's good to be here with the October Monthly Report. And I'll go ahead and jump right in. I know you've got a couple more presentations yet before you're done this afternoon, so I'll get right at it. The unemployment rate ticked down slightly in September, which is the latest information that we have. As you can see in the graphic, the red line for 2016, we've been hovering right around that 2% level. Well, really since about May or April. Compares to a South Dakota rate of 2.4% and nationally a rate of 4.8%. So very, very strong employment numbers, certainly here locally, but even statewide and nationally, that has improved considerably over the last couple of years. Building permits, another indicator that we do track. You can see that through October, that blue line on a year-to-date basis for 16 is just slightly behind where we were a year ago in October. It's a little over 99% of where we were, so it's less than 1% behind where we were a year ago, which of course 15 was a high water mark through the end of the year. Through year to date this year, we've issued about $611 in permits. So again, very, very strong construction activity taking place in the local economy. Looking at sales tax rates, the 12-month rolling growth rate, we ended October at 3.4% when compared to the 12 months prior. So the 3.4% represents a very modest improvement from what I reported to you a month ago, but certainly a good sign that it didn't slide. It actually improved a little bit. Just to kind of put some perspective on it in relation to the budget, if we ended 2016, and of course we've got 2 more months worth of sales tax collections to recognize, but if we end the year with 3% growth, that would put us about $2.5 million below what was budgeted for sales tax revenues. And that number is kind of what we've been using to manage to. So at 3% growth, that's where we would end the year. Of course, as I say, currently we're running at 3.4%, so we're doing a little better than that. That $2.5 million gap in revenue represents about 1.5% of the total fund budget. So that kind of puts the numbers into perspective for you. Looking at the entertainment tax dollars, of course, we track that as a measure of discretionary dollars that are rolling around in the local economy. That continues to grow at 4.3% over the last 12 months. Still a very respectable, certainly not the peak that we saw a year or so ago, but still very, very respectable level of growth in entertainment tax revenues. Looking now at the general fund, revenues and expenditures year to date, we've taken in revenues of $105.5 million. That represents 69% of what we budgeted for 2016. Last year, we had taken in $103 million. So we've taken in a couple million more, but that's last year we were at 71% of our budget. So we are tracking behind budget, as we've been saying for quite some time now, on revenues. In response to that, we have adjusted expenditures and managed with those lower revenues year to date Expenditures are at $118.2 million. That represents 74% of what was budgeted to be spent this year. Last year at this time, we're at 78%. So you can see where the share of our budget that we've spent through the first 10 months is fairly slightly smaller than where we were a year ago. We continue, as the monthly financial report, kind of the write-up in the report indicates, we continue to expect, and we're projecting to end the year at that 25% reserve level or slightly above that. So that has been the goal from the beginning of the year, from the time the budget was adopted, and we are still projecting to end the year. Now, granted, we've got some time left to go. I suppose anything can happen. Certainly, when it comes to the weather, we don't know what's going to happen. But every indication that we do have is that we'll be able to finish the year where we had projected to finish. Before I do ask for your questions, there is one item coming up that I'd like to brief you on briefly today, kind of begin to familiarize you a little bit with an item that's going to come before you next month. And it has to do with goes back to the pension reforms that the council adopted back in 2013. And we're stepping through some of the final phases of that, really the final step of that pension reform, and it has to do with retiree health insurance. And I might just give you a little bit of the history. Within the city's pension system, money has been set aside and accumulated in a separate account. It's called a 401H account under the Internal Revenue Code. Money has been accumulated in that account for many years to fund a portion of retiree health insurance premiums. So prior to the pension reforms that were adopted, the city was responsible to pay a portion of the retirees' health insurance premiums. And the city, unlike, that's fairly common among municipalities and governmental entities, but one thing that was unique about Sioux Falls is that we were actually setting money aside to pay that future liability. There were very few entities that actually did that. Well, as part of the reforms to the city's pension system that the council adopted in 2013, access for retirees to the city's health insurance plan was eliminated. So employees who retired in 2014 or later no longer have access to stay on the city's health insurance plan. And so that change, when that change took effect, that greatly reduced the city's liability for future retiree health insurance premiums. So their employees that have not yet retired will not have access, and so the city will not have a liability for that, even though leading up to that point in 2014, the city had been gradually setting money aside to fund those liabilities. So as a result, the assets that had been set aside for this purpose within the pension system are greater than the remaining liability for future insurance premiums. So that's one of the really good news pieces of the pension reform that was adopted by the council in 2013. So we were setting money aside for many years. The rules changed so that retirees no longer had access to the plan, so those assets that have been accumulated are more than what's really necessary to pay those future liabilities. And there are still liabilities for those folks that did retire in 2013 or earlier that are still on the city's health plan. Once employees hit 65, they're eligible for Medicare. They're no longer eligible to stay on the city's plan. So there's a limited window of time within which retirees stay on the city's plan. The amount of assets in that, what I call the 401H account, that are over and above the amount needed to pay the future retiree health insurance premiums can be used to help fund the city's pension benefit contributions. So each year the city and the employees contribute money into the pension fund for those eventual pension benefits. But because there are excess dollars now, or dollars that aren't needed in that separate account for health insurance, those dollars can be used then to offset future city contributions for pension benefits. In order to utilize those dollars to offset future city pension contributions, the 401H account must be closed and a new trust, which is called a 115 trust, must be open. It's really, It's really not as complicated as it sounds. I know from a legal standpoint it is fairly complicated, and anytime you're dealing with the Internal Revenue Code it becomes very complicated, but it's really in its simplest form, it's really quite basic. We've got more money than we need in the old trust account. We can't really access that for any other purpose without closing it. So we're going to close the old trust account, open a new one, put what money is needed to pay future premiums in that. Any dollars remaining will go into the pension fund to be used to offset future city contributions to the pension. And so that's a significant part of the savings over the next 25 or 30 years that the city will recognize. The pension system boards have been working through this process for well over a year. We've been working with the actuary as well as a tax attorney and someone that is an expert on pensions and the Internal Revenue Code. The board will meet next week, and they are expected to give their final thumbs up to the recommended changes to the city's pension ordinances to close that old trust account and open the new trust. And essentially what will happen as part of this change, that assets will be deposited into this new trust in an amount that will fully fund that future liability or that obligation that the city has for those future premiums for retiree health insurance. So we want to fully fund that obligation, and the remaining assets will be deposited then into the two pension trusts to offset future city pension contributions. As I say, it sounds a whole lot more complicated than it really is. We've got more money than we need in one place, and we can utilize that excess to offset future city costs. The ordinance that will come before you next month will also update the current ordinance to be consistent with the latest financial reporting requirements, or the Governmental Accounting Standards Board has made a lot of changes in recent years in what's required in terms of pension disclosures and pension financial reporting. So the ordinances will be updated to reflect that, as well as IRS pension regulations. We have to be much more explicit in some of our pension ordinances as to what benefits are provided. For example, for military service credit, there are federal rules and regulations that we must comply with, and it has to be expressly laid out in the ordinance. So those are included in the ordinance that'll come before you next month. As I mentioned, this is the final step the city needs to take to achieve the very significant long-term savings to be accomplished with the pension reforms that the council adopted back in 2013. And I think it's important for everyone to understand that none of the changes to the current pension ordinances that we're talking about will impact pension benefits in any way. They won't go up, they won't go down as a result of this. It's really taking care of the trust dollars and making sure that we're maximizing the beneficial use of those dollars. You will, and on your schedule for the December 6th informational meeting, we'll be here with a full presentation on that. We also will have the attorney that's been working with us on this available to answer any questions you folks have. And then first reading of those ordinance changes will be on December 6th. So with that, I will conclude my remarks and open it up for any questions you have on that particular topic or anything really related to the monthly financials.
Thank you, Tracy. Councilor Mabott.
Thank you, Director Sherbeck. Mr. Chair, he presented on a whole bunch of things, so we get extra question time, I hope. You answered my first question about timeline on this, the pension changes that you're talking about. This is really a basic question because now you've placed it out in front of the public who doesn't necessarily, I shouldn't say the public doesn't, I don't necessarily understand the way pensions work. And so can you tell me how is it that we know that we have too much money in that fund? And can we assure people that those folks that should be covered by that fund are going to be covered? And then why did we have too much? Why couldn't we guess it better? Can you kind of wrap that into a sort of, give me that fourth grade level so I get it?
Sure. We rely on actuaries to analyze our pension system, and that would include the pension benefits as well as the retiree health benefits. And they look at the population of employees that we have today, their ages, how long they're expected to work, how long they're expected to live after retirement. They look at all of those things and tell us what amount we need to set aside to fund those future benefits. And so we rely on actuaries, as every pension system around the country does. One of the things that makes Sioux Falls unique is that we have consistently followed the recommendations of actuaries. Many of those that have gotten into trouble have not. They haven't kept up with making those contributions. The reason we have excess dollars now, and I hesitate to use that word, we really, because it wasn't necessarily fully funded. If we hadn't made the changes that we did 2 years ago, we would not have excess dollars in there. But because there's a very finite number now, and we're not adding any more retirees to our city's health insurance plan, the responsibility that the city has to pay a portion of those premiums got shrunk a lot in a very short period of time. So, for example, anyone that's working today, they may stay with the city until they retire, but when they do, they will not have access to the city's health insurance plan. The city will have no responsibility to pay a part of their premium for whatever they do for health insurance. If those reforms had not taken place, there would be an ongoing and growing liability, growing responsibility to pay for those premiums. So we've kind of gotten ahead of the game by starting to set some money aside, and then the assumption or the rule changed to say, no, after January 1st of 2014, future retirees will no longer have access to the retirees or the city's health insurance plan. So the obligation on the city's part got a lot smaller.
It's just really interesting to me when we watch the national news and we see, you know, other local governments, municipalities, counties, whatever, that aren't in the financial good graces that we are. It's so interesting to sit back and go, how did we end up being, I don't know, I guess we're just that smart. I mean, the people before us were that smart that this was ready in this way, and we've managed it so well. I just appreciate that. As a layperson, I'm not a money person. I've never said I was. This is one of those times when I just go, yay, Sioux Falls, right? So I appreciate that. I guess my other question about this, and then I would also then hope that we have questions about budget or the financial report as well. My other question is, what are the things that we could use that money for legally? You know, in terms of, you've got health funds left over in that 401H. What are the legal things we can move that money into?
Right, and of course the money, as it is today, it's all within the pension fund. It was all contributed with the idea that there will be future benefits paid with that. Within just the pension part of the fund, we're currently funded at overall at about an 88% level. You hear about pension funds and whether or not they're fully funded or if they're underfunded. Generally speaking, pensions are looked at as being well funded or funded to a healthy level if they hit 80% or above. So we're in a very good position, but we still need to make contributions to grow that, and the goal is always to get to 100% of funded. So those dollars that are kind of locked in that health insurance trust really need to be freed up and would be under these changes that are going to come before you, to be put into basically taken out of one bucket within the pension system and put into a different bucket within the system to pay future benefits. So what that will do is it will reduce the amount of contributions that the city will have to make in the future. And so that's what these ordinances will do, and that's where that will put us. Now, legally, I think if you wanted to take a real radical approach, and again, this is something that other states and counties and municipalities have gotten into trouble by raiding their pension funds for purposes other than meeting that long-term obligation. So, I mean, if you wanted to take that money out, for example, and spend it on whatever, building something, then that, I mean, legally, could it be done? I think it probably could be. I would for one would never stand up here and advocate for utilizing funds that have been set aside in a pension system for that kind of thing.
Right. There's a big difference between what's legal and what's really the right thing to do.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your answers.
Okay. Councilor Neitzer.
Yeah, just to continue this conversation, it's a good problem to have. Most jurisdictions have a massive unfunded liability. So if I just want to make sure I understand, the liability that's remaining are those who retired prior to 2014.
Right.
And then does the liability extinguish once the last one of those people reaches the age of 65? Or?
Right. Once, yeah, there's a run out, and it will take, I think the actuary has projected it'll take somewhere between 15 and 20 years before the last person is no longer on the city's health plan.
Okay, so we have a very finite knowledge of when it ends. Okay, thank you.
Councilor Staley.
I'm going to reference, first of all, back to the convention we just attended in Pittsburgh, and one of the sessions was called The Next Recession, Planning Begins Now. And there were people from across the country in this session, and this is just going to be a pat on the back for our city council here and for the finance department. But they said, how many of the municipalities have a reserve fund in place? And several did not. And they were saying that the target should be 15% to be in a good standing. And so we have 25%, so that's wonderful. My question is coming back to the budget. Yesterday we got, I think many of us got a lot of phone calls from residents concerned about not getting their streets plowed, and I know there were decisions made because of the weather. But some people asked me when they called about the concern that we may not have enough money coming in to be able to fund snow removal as we have seen it in the past. Is that, if we're coming below, you know, the $2.5 million, at what point is that going to maybe be detrimental to our ability to provide that service, if any time?
Well, as I mentioned, the projection today is that we will end the year of 2016 exactly where we had projected in terms of the dollars in our reserve account that we had budgeted for, that we had anticipated when the 2016 budget was put before the council. And remember, that would have been 6 months before 2016 ever started. So in the summer of 2015, we presented the council with a 2016 budget that projected we would end 2016 with a reserve of about between 25 and 26%. That has not changed. So we continue to project that we will end the year with that reserve intact. So we've made those adjustments in a lot of different areas to compensate for that. The 2017 budget is certainly established at a level that continues to provide that level of service that we're accustomed to without significant reductions in service. You talked about some of them at budget time, really just making what I would consider relatively minor tweaks here and there in terms of some of the park and rec programs, some of those things. But no, there's no expectation that, and again, I mean, the future's uncertain, but there's no expectation at this point that we would make changes in that regard. With that said, every city department has an obligation to approach the services that they provide and always be looking for ways to be more prudent, be more mindful of the taxpayer dollars, and find better, more efficient ways to provide that level of service. And you mentioned the snowstorm Friday, and I think all the decisions that were made for all the right reasons, and I know that information has been shared with you folks, but to me it would be a travesty to spend taxpayer dollars to plow snow if you think it's going to be melting in the next day or two. To me, that's a poor use of taxpayer dollars, and I would never advocate for that. In fact, we've gotten complaints before at times in the past when people had that in mind, that we were plowing snow that we shouldn't be. I mean, certainly there's a fine balance sometimes that the decisions have to be made based on what forecasts are, what expectations are, what the, I mean, they look at a lot of things, including the ground temperature, I think was one thing that was factored into that as well. So sometimes the weather forecasts go in our favor and sometimes they don't, and that's life.
Any other questions for Tracy? Okay, Councilor Erpenbach.
It would be back to the financial report. My questions prior were about the pension. So
Yes,
if I did,
absolutely.
I
Go
just
ahead.
had one other question, sort of related to what Councilor Staley was alluding to, in sort of the futuring that we all kind of are aware of, in our world. If you look at the charts that you've presented us every month over the last year, they're pretty much trending down in terms of tax collections across the board. Still growing. We know it's a growth, but the growth continues to get smaller. Can you talk about kind of what your expectations are going forward? I mean, we're pretty close to the end of the year. Are we visioning for 2017 in terms of, we passed a budget, but is it accurate? What kinds of things, what might we be thinking about, and what might be our plan if those declines continue?
Yeah, a couple things that I'll mention first. The 2016 budget was based on projected sales tax revenue growth of 6%. We're clearly not going to hit that. When the 2017 budget was developed, that the 2016 estimate was revised to 4% growth. So we assumed that in 17 we were going to be growing from a lower base than what we had planned a year before. The 17 budget is based on 4% growth. So if we end the year where we are today at 3.4% growth, yeah, we will be short by 0.6%, which is very, very manageable. Now, if it falls off beyond that, certainly we have to be prepared, and I think we're obligated to make preparations for that in any year, whether revenues are growing faster than we thought or whether they're growing slower than we anticipated. We've got obligation to, plan for the best, but also be prepared for the worst, and we're doing that. We are developing contingency plans that if sales tax revenues, if 2008 is repeated in 2017 where sales tax revenues actually shrink, we need to be prepared for that, and we are taking steps to identify those areas where we would make changes to budgets. The 17 budget was flat. I mean, the operational budget was flat to 16, so there's not a lot of new spending or new initiatives within the budget to say, well, we're just not going to do that. I think the reality is that if that becomes necessary, we won't have any choice but to look a lot harder at service levels and begin to prioritize where will we change service levels. And that's an exercise we're going through right now, and every department will be looking at that with the start of 2017, that if revenues don't grow next year, what will we do? And we will have a very, very definite plan on where we will go with that.
So a 2-word response: shop local.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Not on your computer. Don't buy from Amazon. Go down to the local store and buy it.
Councilor Staley.
Now, kind of a 2-part question. This new administration building, what year are we saying that we're going to have to start making payments for the operational costs of that?
Well, it'll be we expect that it would be completed in 2018. So as we prepare the 2018 budget, we'll be planning for that.
So the first penny will be, part of that's going to be utilized to support that building and the staff, correct?
Right. It would be general fund expense.
And then the swimming pool, we're talking about the $500,000, $500,000 that we're going to be subsidizing. That's all included in the 2017 budget, right?
That's been included in the 17 budget.
Okay, so if that would happen to change or have an override, how do we handle that? Do you come back to us and ask us to take something out of the general fund for that, or?
I'm not sure I follow
the
the question.
reserves?
If what were to happen?
Well, like with the swimming pool, I mean, if as that progresses on and we find out the expense the city has to put forth to subsidize that, how does that look to take, where does that money come from?
Mm-hmm. Well, and those kinds of things really happen every year to some degree or another, where something costs more than we anticipated, and we manage through that. It would depend upon the degree to which costs are higher than expected. We think we did a pretty good job of anticipating what it's going to cost to operate the aquatic center. But if, in your hypothetical, if that turns out to be wrong and we've under budgeted for that, the first course of action is going to be to find other places within the Park and Rec budget to manage through that, so that those dollars can be allocated, or find ways to reduce the cost of operating the aquatics facility. So that's really the first course of action. And the last resort that we would get to would be to come to the council and ask for a supplemental. I mean, it hasn't happened very many times in the last 5 or 6 years that the council's been asked for a supplement. When it has, it's been, at least the one that sticks in my mind was a year end where our snow removal budget had been depleted. It was still snowing, we needed money, and so we came to the council for a supplement. And so it's not something we do very often. It's first priority is to manage through it and manage with live within our means, as it said.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no more questions, any questions I had were answered in the course of your responses to others. So, Tracy, thank you very much. Next item is the annexation program, and that'll be presented by Mike Cooper, Director of Planning and Building Services, and Albert Schmidt, Urban Planner. Welcome, Director Cooper.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Albert will be sharing the presentation duties with me today. I am Mike Cooper with Planning and Building Services, along with Albert Schmidt. And just want to start out by saying that as we talk to you today about our annexation program, remember that this encompasses a lot more folks than the two of us. This crosses a number of city departments, whether it's the attorneys, finance, public works, community development, project management. And so the different aspects of annexation, in addition to the council, involves a lot of folks. But we thought it was a good time today to bring you up to date, to explain again for some of you the second or third time how the annexation program works, why it's important, and some of the challenges that we have now and going forward. So simply, annexation is the process of adding land into the corporate limits of a municipality. We thought it would be interesting to show you a brief historical exhibit of how the city limits have changed over the decades. And since the 2000s that we're into now is the one that we're primarily addressing as we expand out onto those edges, and we bump up against existing property that either chooses not to be in the city or is developed with rural residences that have gone out there specifically to avoid being within an incorporated city. The process of annexation is primarily driven by South Dakota law, the process. But with annexation, there's a commitment that the city will be responsible for providing certain types of services at some future point in time to the property that's annexed. Then there's also going to be benefits as well as cost to the property that's being annexed. And of course, one of the benefits that we'll talk about is being able to vote in city elections. By South Dakota statute, there's two different ways that property can be annexed into the city. The first one is by petition, where the property owner or owners agrees that they would like to be added into the corporate limits. And so that petition has to be signed by not less than 3/4 of the registered voters and the owners of not less than 3/4 of the value of the property being requested for annexation. That's probably 95% or more of the ways that property has been annexed historically into the city. And you know that you as a council have been voting on a number of those off and on. The second way that property can be annexed is by city initiation. South Dakota statute provides that there is a way that the city can initiate annexation of properties if there's a public purpose in mind, or if there's a specific reason why it's in the city's interest to initiate the annexation of properties. And there's a long list of steps that we have to go through There's a study required which basically outlines what the impacts will be to the property being annexed, as well as to the municipality in terms of providing services to that property. The city council is required to pass a resolution of intent, and then finally there's a resolution of annexation. And also in the case where there's property that's not platted, then the respective county commission also has to weigh in to require some resolution of support for the annexation. There's kind of an intermediate step that we've been using in recent years called the pre-annexation agreement. And this is really helpful in those cases where we're talking to property owners about future growth of the city. Maybe there's an arterial street improvement coming or a sanitary sewer expansion project coming that will potentially impact that property owner or owners. And we want to get them in line, so to speak, in a queue to be aware that at some future point annexation will be triggered. We've done this for individual properties, but we've also done it for some existing rural residential subdivisions. That pre-annexation can be triggered based on a specific date, or it can be triggered based on certain improvements that would be anticipated in the future. So it's another good way that we have been using, a good method that we have been using to deal with properties that maybe are not ready yet for annexation, but we know that at some future point need to be brought into the city limits.
All right, and with our annexation program about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago here, we kind of started identifying those locations and trying to initiate contact to get ahead of development or try to catch up to development in some instances too. And so that's where we developed our map of our 60-some potential areas around the City of Sioux Falls where they're kind of islands. We typically aimed for areas that were either completely surrounded, there were kind of peninsulas where they were surrounded on 3 sides, or they were abutting the city limits and they already had existing rural subdivisions in them. So kind of those were our main criteria for identifying those areas. And again, the map doesn't identify the number 1 through number 4. Here's who we're gonna start here and work our way down the list. It more just identifies these are the ones around us that we're aware of, and we're gonna work on contacting them. And then on a yearly basis, we take a look at which ones are out there and which ones we think are kind of the top 5, top 4 important ones to initiate that discussion with and try to work on the annexation. The one that you'll see here in December actually is our first city-initiated annexation to you is the Mesquite property, and we'll have that December 6th come to you. So we wanted to point that out to you just to start thinking about kind of what that means, what this is bringing forward. It's a single-family house out there. So this is, again, that study process where we went through, we did the study to show that we have growth in the area. We've calculated out the potential development of the lot in the future, the tax risks or the tax increase for the property owner, showing how it's connected to our existing water, roads, sewer, all those items. This kind of gives you a breakdown over the past couple of years of what actively we have out there. We have ones that we've completed already through the initiating the discussion and them coming in petitioning. But as you can see in 2015, we still have a couple that we're working out the details where we started the initiation at that time. And each one is a unique snowflake, so to speak. There's a lot of details that come along. I mean, it's so particular about where it's at, what's going on, that it's really hard to say, well, area A and area B are both out there, so they're both going to take this amount of time. It really varies depending on what's going on. 2016, you can see we still have 5 kind of active ones out there where we've been meeting with people. Some of them we're just aware, we're watching them, we're trying to see if we need to meet with them, or if, in some instances, private development's already coming in anyways, so we don't want to, we don't need to get involved because they're already looking at coming in without our contacting and reaching out to them. And then next year, we've identified 4 others. We had a 5th one, moved it up to this year, so we kind of, 2016 had an extra one that we pulled from 17, where we just tried to get ahead of it. But that's what we have, who we'll be reaching out to next year in preparations for talking about annexation and those things.
So as we go out and talk to property owners, whether it's an individual owner or an actual existing subdivision, the first thing that they'll say is, why are you coming to us? Why are you wanting to annex this property? So we talk about the benefits or the reasons for annexation, and an annexation program. Provides growth area for future residential and business development. In the case of vacant land, it allows for a more rational and efficient delivery of services to property or surrounding properties. The cost of city services are able to be spread out to those properties that are receiving a benefit from city services. And then I think that one of the most important reasons is that it really helps us program smarter, more efficiently, our future capital improvements that will impact the private sector. If we're looking at future road improvements or water or sewer expansion projects or a neighborhood park, how can we program those funds, those projects, without knowing what those service areas are going to be and the timing of when those properties will be incorporated into the city limits. I think it also helps the private sector know what's the city's growth area, what's the timing of city services to those growth areas. We've divided the city into different tiers. Tier 1 is that geographical area that we can expect to serve within a 3 to 5 year period. Tier 2 goes out beyond that 5 year, and then Tier 3. So having a good capital program, a good annexation program really works well together. And when you have property that is not contiguous, or that creates these holes or islands within the incorporated area, it makes that goal a little bit more challenging in many cases. And we'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of our presentation. But you can imagine that if property is not annexed and it's surrounded by developed property that's receiving city services, is there a fairness there as far as the equity of sharing the cost of city services or the benefit of city services? So as we talk about why it's important to have a good annexation program, and we meet with property owners, the next thing that they're going to ask is, what's the benefits? What's in it for us? We're pretty happy with our rural fire system. We're pretty happy with our septic system or our well and maybe our gravel road. But as we try to quantify and at least put into place some of those talking points, we go through water quality is huge. And in many cases, our water rates are better than what the rural water systems are charging. Obviously, having a top-rate sanitary sewer district or service is important in terms of environmental benefits. Storm drainage is one that people don't think a lot about, but it's one that we spend a lot of time and resources on managing stormwater. City code enforcement, whether it's health, fire, zoning, property maintenance issues. The big one, obviously, is street maintenance services. And yes, we do plow snow when we need to and when we should. Building safety through our plan review, permitting and inspections. Public safety, we talk about the response times for our fire, police, and ambulance services. Animal control protection. So we go through these and we talk to property owners about them. But obviously, they don't always understand what these benefits can mean and how do you quantify what these benefits would be in terms of the cost of the annexation. So the next chart that Albert will go through is, again, trying to explain some of that.
So fairly briefly on this chart, we developed this to try to help out the average citizen, property owner going, all right, so if you want more money from me, where's this money going to go? How's this money being spent? And so by looking at the 2016 approved budget, we just kind of took the percents and took a simplistic approach to trying to show people based on the budget how that money would be allocated in the general fund if you put $100 if you put your money in. So to give you a little more idea here, these amounts all reflecting of a $200,000 home value, $943 in property tax for the city of Sioux Falls. So when I talk about annexation, the increase that you would see from a typical property owner for $200,000, we estimate at about $500 a year. And that would get us to the city portion at $943. Again, you still pay some of your existing taxes. You're still paying for the county. You're still paying for those kind of levies, your school system. None of that has changed, so those are still paid. The big thing that changes typically is you're getting rid of the township levy and you're getting the City of Sioux Falls levy. In addition to that, we also impose a couple of assessments on an annual basis, $1 per front foot for annual street maintenance, and then our stormwater collection to help out with our citywide system for stormwater maintenance.
When we're out talking to property owners that are, that's vacant land, that's ready to be developed, in those cases, the annexation process is probably not as challenging as it would be with existing rural residential subdivisions. So we wanted to spend a little time talking to you today about the challenges with these rural subdivisions in consideration of annexation. For the most part, they're on existing large lots, a half acre or larger, with limited services, whether it's rural water, wells, sometimes they have gravel roads, sometimes they have asphalt. The extent and cost of improvements can be based on front footage, the square footage of a lot, or the number of lots affected. The way that we can assess improvements to property owners is also pretty well listed by city statute and state law. But what we find is with all these different scenarios, when we start talking about, well, okay, what's the cost to a particular property owner if they're going to upgrade their large lot to city services or city improvements? They start comparing back and forth, and it's hard to get everybody to understand why there's such a difference within these existing subdivisions, even among adjacent lots or adjacent properties. And then finally, the assessment cost for improvements can be very large. And so again, we hear back, well, what's the financial benefit to me if I'm going to be assessed $20,000, $25,000 over 10 or 20 years? Am I going to get that back in terms of the value or the benefit to my property? So as we go through these scenarios with these rural subdivisions, we try to be as specific as we can about what these assessments would be, how they're structured, whether you're on a corner lot or interior lot. And obviously, because the front footage or the width of your lot is going to have a huge impact on the amount of your assessment. If you have a 1 acre lot that's long and narrow, or a 1 acre lot that's square, the cost is going to be different, but maybe the benefits are the same. So that's kind of what we struggle with and the challenges that we have as we go through that. And then also dealing with stormwater drainage. As I mentioned before, people don't think about that very often, but as we work with these neighborhoods to get them annexed and knowing that there's going to be urban development around them, we have to be very cognizant of how those storm drainage impacts are going to be dealt with over time. So next, we want to give you a case study of one that we have been dealing with for quite some time.
So yeah, this is kind of one of our prime examples of why it's important to try to reduce the number of new rural subdivisions out there. Prairie Meadows subdivisions on the west side of Sioux Falls by 41st and Ellis. The left-hand corner up there, you'll see the intersection of Ellis and 41st Street. Again, New Lewis was announced in the paper the other day that they're going to go in this general location, so it's a growing area, as you can see. So we've worked with this area for about 1.5 years. Now, when you identify these subdivisions, people want to know from day one, what's the cost going to be to me? How much is this going to cost me? Well, on day one, we try to get ahead of things. We try to just start approaching people going, what do you look for in your neighborhood. How do you envision things developing? So it's hard from that initial point to go guarantee it's going to be, X amount of dollars. So you kind of look at what level of design do you have done before you can really give them a real rough estimate, and that takes time to get to, unfortunately. But you try to give them a ballpark first, and then work your way and then go in exactly what you're looking for, what you're talking about. With this specific one, again, it's about a 2-year process. 60 plus property owners, 110 lots. You're looking at 3 years of overall meetings. We back and forth on what we would do, what they would kind of cover, and to figure out what we'd kind of come to an agreement. Our end-up goal here was to get the neighborhood to petition in, so we're going to aim that for that 75% of value and 75% of registered voters to send us a petition to annex the whole area in, and to try to consider that designs. In this, when we cat down to it, we've got a very specific design. We came up with a pretty good number, which we felt pretty confident in our estimate. And this area, that most of the lots ranged around the $33,000 mark, but some of them range as high as like 60. So this provides us that rough of when you develop before the city gets there, this potentially is kind of that cost level of area. And when we don't look at it being continually annexed in, then typically we suggest to people, if we have a good estimate like this, we then go typically try to conservatively go 3 to 5% annual inflation cost for construction, and that will hopefully kind of give you a benchmark for where your construction costs may be in the future when we come back to this, because eventually these areas are more than likely going to have to become part of city limits and be urbanized and set up. Again, when you look specifically at this neighborhood, when we got down to meetings, and after 3 years of meeting with people, they got a little sick of seeing us, but they got a lot of information from us. At the end of the day, the last thing we had, the open house, we had about 25% property owners that were still in favor of annexation, even with the costs, because they saw the benefits of the roads, the sewer, the water, getting rid of the stormwater issues that they currently have in the neighborhood, and seeing those improvements being made. And a lot of them, of the 25%, were very adamant, like, this needs to happen sooner rather than later. I mean, this is a needed thing today, not tomorrow. And why put off what you can pay for cheaper today and make more expensive tomorrow or the year after? Again, so we looked at that, and then you come down to the decision of, all right, if they don't want to, if we can't get that 75%, then do we come forward as a city initiated? In this instance, the decision was made to, at this point in time, let it kind of sit for a bit, let the sanitary sewer district figure out their issues, their needs, and then reevaluate later on. So, whereas with the Metzger one coming up next week, in 2 weeks, December 6th, we took the approach of everything's already done. We're going to take it to city council, have you guys come up with a decision for us if whether or not it's fair to incorporate them in the city limits of Sioux Falls or not.
The map that Albert showed you at the beginning identified over 60 parcels of land that we've identified that we would like to work on this annexation program. A lot of those are existing development properties, some are vacant, and then some are the larger rural subdivisions that I've been referring to. So we're going to continue to face those as the city limits expands out. But what we've talked about as part of our annexation program, are there policies that we can either expand or emphasize more in the future that will prevent some of these situations from happening as the city limits continues to expand out. We do have our joint jurisdictional boundaries with both Lincoln and Minnehaha counties. Within those joint jurisdictional areas, we have authority for plating approval and also for zoning approval. And this exhibit is one that we're working through now to potentially expand those boundaries of joint planning and zoning that would impact both of the counties. Right now, with our plating and subdivision approval, anything within that extraterritorial jurisdiction has to be approved by the City of Sioux Falls as well as the county in terms of plating or replating. And with the zoning districts, when those properties are primarily zoned agricultural, the type of development is pretty limited for residential particularly. The only way a new rural subdivision could expand is they would have to go through a zoning change to rural residential. And we have, I think, a really good understanding with both counties over the years that those are the types of rezonings that that we would not support unless it was a really unusual situation where we knew that there was going to be city services provided in a short term. So we have those two policies in place now, but some of the things that we're talking about that maybe we could enhance would be to limit infrastructure connections, such as water and sewer, to properties that are not annexed. We do have properties right now that are getting city water and sewer that are not in the city limits. We could also look at limiting our improvements of arterial streets in front of property that's not annexed. And that's one that we really struggle with, because you can imagine when we're doing a major arterial corridor that's needed for our traffic system, and there are pockets of property that are not annexed, then you struggle with getting the right-of-way secured. You struggle with where the access points are going to be. You struggle with not being able to assess for sidewalk or other, the timing of the other capital improvements. So maybe we need to be more strict in terms of initiating annexation of property that's going to be benefiting from a future arterial street project. Another idea is to coordinate with the two counties in terms of reviewing development permits. We do not see or review building permit requests within that extraterritorial jurisdiction. So if Lincoln or Minnehaha County wants to approve a building permit that's allowed within that zoning, we do not see it. We also do not see septic permits. So if a property owner wants to replace a septic system, we do not see that. And maybe if we know that that's going to be an area that is targeted for future expansion of sanitary sewer or annexation, we can sit down and work with those property owners on at least some type of a pre-annexation agreement, so that we're not facing the situation that, well, I just put in a new $20,000 septic system that's going to last me many more years. I don't need city sewer anymore, so I don't have any interest in being annexed. So those are some of the things that we're talking about, that we can strengthen our policies, at least in terms of limiting future annexation challenges. But what we want to end with today is not only to bring you up to speed on what we're doing with our annexation program, but also maybe to emphasize that as we continue to talk to these rural subdivisions, it's important for us to know that we have the support of the council in terms of continuing on with an annexation program, in terms of support for these policies going forward, and then just helping us give a better message, or maybe a clearer message, on what level of improvements these rural areas are going to be required in terms of future annexation. So that's really what we wanted to accomplish today, and we would like to continue to work with you on the council, whether at this level or at a committee level, to have more discussions about some of the issues and policies that we brought up today. So with that, we'll stop and see if you have any questions or answers.
Councilor Neitzer.
About Prairie Meadows and just annexation in general. So I've met with a number of the citizens in that area, and been out to some of their homes. And obviously, as you know, the big hang-up really seemed to be the number. That was really what it was. There was a lot of discussion about low-impact development and whether or not to do that, but really it was a number. So something I've struggled with is, and maybe you can help me, is and maybe it is it equitable for them to pay 100% of this development cost? So as an example, when there's a subdivision annexed into the city, like off of TLS Road close to where I am, and then I see, what I'm seeing now is the developers put in the roads, and then the street lights have gone up, and now they're starting to build the homes. Is there $33,000 to $60,000 worth of improvements that are built into the cost of, the lot and the home that I buy? Is it pretty much the same?
Yeah, typically you're going to see any of those costs of infrastructure improvements are going to be put into the lots from day one, so that the cheapest lot, which a developer puts in, which is the first one, because the services are right there, to that most expensive one, which might be phase 6 or phase 7, 10 years later. It's all equalized out throughout all those lots, so they see that. I mean, you might not see it directly because you're not going to get a bill for it, but when you buy a lot, or even when you buy a house that was built already, you're paying for those costs in that value of that house.
So I guess what I'm getting at, I'm like, are they paying for basically on the back end what we paid for, kind of on the front end?
Yeah, I think the difference is what I mentioned earlier is that when you have these large lots, typically a city lot is going to be 85, 100 feet. Could be as small as 50 feet. If you have a 1 acre lot with maybe 125 or 150 feet of frontage, that's where the huge assessment costs come into play. Now, maybe there's an opportunity that could be split, but in most cases, they put the house right in the center of the lot. So that's one of the struggles that we face. And in terms of what's fair, I think that's some of the additional discussions that we would like to have with the council in terms of, in the past, a number of these rural subdivisions were annexed and they were not required to put in curb and gutter and sidewalk. And you probably know the areas that we're talking about. I'm not sure that that's necessarily the best way to do it, but as we struggle with the cost and the benefit discussion, that's kind of where we're looking for some more ideas, maybe, or more options.
And you have one more?
Yeah, and that is a good point. I mean, the typical residential lot like mine is 65 feet of frontage, whereas some of these might be 100 or more, especially. And then, so the double, or I shouldn't say double frontage. So on the corner lots, so I know a lot of them, their eyeballs popped on the idea of them paying more. And then I thought that there was maybe a discussion about spreading the cost. Was there pushback on that from others who said, why should I have to pay for his or her frontage?
I've had a couple comments from people saying that why should a double frontage lot not have to pay for both sides? Again, it was just, you look at it, you try to balance the needs of the population out there and go, and there's articles out there too of the legality of charging for two sides versus one side of it. So in our concessions, we chose to just pick one side of a corner lot and put that cost on them and then cover the rest of that from a more generalized tax base.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Councilor Erpenbach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both. Annexation is always an interesting mess sometimes, right? The question I have is about the one that's one of these things is not like the others. Can you talk about Pine Lake Hills? There's a pre-annexation agreement from the Munson administration on that piece, and my understanding is that it could have been annexed as early as January 2016. Can you talk about what the history is on this and where that might be headed? It's one of those big islands. When you look at that map, it's a big island.
Yeah, the history of that is that we were looking at expanding our sanitary sewer to the east with our new east side lift station. And one of the areas that we identified that we needed to put a sewer through was that Pine Lake Hills development area. So the pre-annexation agreement allowed us to do that, but also gave the neighborhood more time to prepare to react for a future timeline of when they would be potentially annexed. So that's how that came about. It was really for us to get a sanitary sewer easement through that neighborhood, but they weren't ready to hook up to it yet.
Well, because the question I've had from constituents out there, and it's not my district, but I feel like I have one big district, right, has been, I need to replace my, the septic system now. Are you coming or not? And so that's been the core question there now.
I think there's one important thing to note on that one too. There's two areas to Pine Lake, north and the south. We have an agreement with the north, not the south. So technically, the area that we have the agreement with isn't contiguous to the city limit. So we need to be contiguous before we can annex an area in as well.
Good point. Good. Thank you. I appreciate the input.
Councilor Staley?
And I know of the places around town where they don't have curb and gutter put in, some very nice residences. The word that comes back to me is affordable housing. And Councilor Neitzert and I were at the Prairie Meadows group this spring and listened to some of those homeowners. And the concern I had and empathy I had was for a homeowner who might have a $140,000 home. They were expressing they could be assessed like a $35,000 payment on this. And at the time we were talking about this, I was thinking we've been hearing about the city being able to borrow money at low interest rate, like 1.5% at different times. We're looking for the best deals we can get. And am I right in saying that the interest on these things would be 3%? Or is it 3.5?
On the assessments, I think is what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, I believe that was.
3%?
And it can vary depending on the length of the assessment.
So some of these people were coming up, they've been in their homes for years, they're on a limited income, and this is going to really, to me, I think it could put a big hardship on them. And at the time, I was thinking, why couldn't we negotiate with them and get why couldn't we even just say someone who could qualify would have no interest? I mean, they pay the money back over the 15 or 20 years, but we wouldn't be charging them a 3% rate on that. So I don't know, is there flexibility in these terms?
The city council, I think it was last year, we passed an ordinance that allows the annexation of the assessments to go up to a 20-year period. And of course, that interest rate will vary depending on if it's a 5 or a 20-year assessment. So that was a way of spreading those costs over a longer period of time that we thought would be at least one additional option to offer property owners. But the whole question of, city participation as well as the amount of improvements is really one that we're still kind of going back and forth on. And that's really what I would like to have a chance to talk more about in the future as we go forward with our annexation program.
Any other questions?
I can add one more thing real quick. When you look at the detail of the assessments and the APRs on them and those things, it actually kind of breaks down to two separate amounts depending on if you're paying for road or sewer kind of situation. So there are two different numbers that you have to use in there to get kind of an average that we kind of try to give people. But some of the stuff you're talking about would probably be more of a new style of program rather than what we use right now if you want to do a city loan to kind of have different rates. That makes sense. No.
Well, would there ever be an opportunity to bring community development into this? I'm just thinking of people who really aren't going to be able to afford this extra cost, and they really didn't buy into this, especially when you've got people who don't want to do this.
Yeah, I think without being specific today, what we're saying is that we would like to continue this discussion with the council and just discuss different ideas as we go forward with these rural subdivisions particularly. So that's kind of what we're looking for today, is not solutions today, but at least awareness and dialogue of how we can continue to try to address these challenges in the future.
Okay, Councilor Erpenbach.
Question for leadership then. Is this something that we want to, as a council, move to a committee so that we do continue that conversation? Are we at that point with this, or is that something that you're not ready to decide?
That's possible, good possibility that we could do just that. And I would think possibly the land use committee would be.
Right, because what Councilor Staley is saying is valid, and,
Yes.
and it's part of that. Yeah, it's taxpayer dollars. Do we loan it out for free? Do we help those folks that really are in need? I mean, it is a conversation. It's a policy conversation that council needs to have.
Yeah, I think there is the need, as Director Cooper had stated, for the council and for Director Cooper's office to continue that conversation, not only with the residents, but with us as a council too.
And we just want to make sure that we have the support of the council of whatever direction we're going to go. And it's interesting that we're having this right after our financial report because, we talked about what happens next year. So again, if we're talking about potentially more city participation, how does that play into the overall discussion? But that's why we want to continue to work on this together.
Absolutely. And good suggestion, Councilor Erpenbach. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Seeing no more questions on that topic, our last
Anxious to get up here now.
gentlemen, thank you very much. The last topic on our agenda today, proposed changes to the private best management practices, aka BMP ordinance, and Lance Weatherly, our principal engineer, will present. Welcome, Lance.
Thank you. Good evening, Council. Lance Weatherly, representing Public Works, presenting a proposed ordinance regarding operations and maintenance of privately owned BMPs, also known as best management practices. To start, this ordinance is a continuation of the city's water quality efforts in the Big Sioux River watershed. We also want to educate private BMP owners, as many of these BMPs are over 10 years of age. And we also want to be proactive about water quality. So first off, what is a BMP? A BMP is essentially an engineered stormwater device which treats and stores stormwater to be released. So in the picture up there, the lower right-hand corner is essentially an engineered drawing where stormwater would go into that basin and be filtered. It would be filtering out any potential contaminants of sand, oils, debris. Even like it's November 22nd, you wouldn't be thinking we'd be talking about drainage, but it rained today. This is adjacent to parking lots. There's salt, sands, things like that. So this is what these devices are intended to keep out of our Big Sioux River watershed. What is the difference between a private and a public BMP? Essentially, a public BMP is one that's been identified in our stormwater master plan to provide water quality on a regional area, and they're owned and operated by the city. The picture on the left is an image of a regional BMP. They're generally larger to provide treatment for a regional basis. Privately owned BMPs are required to be installed by a landowner when the area is not served by a public BMP. They might be an area in the core of the city that's been redeveloped, or in certain areas where development is draining to an area that a regional BMP has not been identified in our master plan. This next slide is essentially a picture of where privately owned BMPs are within our city. One thing I always like to note about this one is essentially the BMPs spread throughout the city. They are our stormwater treatment plant. So it's spread throughout the city, whereas wastewater, right now it's conveyed to a single central plant for treatment. Private BMPs, public BMPs are spread throughout the city. Drainage doesn't go one way, so we need to treat it at appropriate locations. So why is a privately owned BMP ordinance needed? As I mentioned before, private BMPs have been required and constructed for over 10 years. Many of them are exhibiting some signs that need some operation and maintenance upkeep. The city must ensure private BMPs are operated and maintained to achieve stormwater quality guidelines. The city recently went through an EPA audit of our stormwater program, and one of the notes on there is that it is the city's responsibility to ensure that private BMPs are in compliance with the city's stormwater MS4 permit. They also noted that they encouraged, they encouraged us to take this ordinance, this proposed ordinance through to be adopted. And also, no ordinance currently exists for requiring operations and maintenance of private BMPs. So this picture here is references of peer communities that we looked at their BMP ordinances in developing the proposed one in front of you. We also used existing ordinance language within our industrial pretreatment program that we have now and utilized a lot of that ordinance as basis for drafting this proposed private BMP stormwater ordinance. As with any change, we want to engage stakeholders and the community prior to this. We did outreach and solicit feedback from our industry of developers, contractors, and engineers. We did go to IRAB twice. It presented the first time. There was a request to get the stakeholders some more time to consider it. We brought it back again, and IRAB did formally support it. We also had a separate meeting with the Home Builders Association to discuss it in more detail with them as well. So the proposed ordinance regulations, in summary, private BMPs would be required to properly construct, operate, and maintain the function of privately owned BMPs. Some common maintenance activities would be removing debris and vegetation, sediment, repairing any eroded areas and reseeding them, replacing filter media, sand, or pest control if there's muskrats or things like that are in there. The picture in the background is of a mechanical stormwater treatment device, and what it's showing is there's a lot of debris in there that needs to be cleaned out. So these are the type of things we're looking for, is to making sure these private BMP devices are maintaining as they were intended to. One section of the ordinance talks about right of entry, inspection, and sampling. There are most of these private BMPs are in a very publicly accessible location, out by a boulevard or a parking strip or a sidewalk. However, there are some that are behind fences, some are underground. So what this ordinance does is it provides the city to have the staff to be able to access those if need be. We also, as a result of the presentation of the Land Use Committee prior, we did put in the ordinance so that we are going to be providing notice prior to inspections. That was one discussion we had at IRAB, and we did intend to comply with that, but we did, as a result of the Land Use Committee discussion, put that language in the ordinance. Enforcement and penalty. Private BMP owners, they shall receive an initial written statement identifying any corrective actions and provided a reasonable time not to exceed 90 days for the correction to be made. And then if that correction isn't made within those days, then the city may issue a notice of violation. Also, there was some discussion at Land Use Committee about what is public is that first notice. We put some explicit language in the ordinance to clarify that the first one is an initial written statement, and the follow-up, if it isn't done within that time period, it would be an NOV. Especially with this being the first time around inspecting, we are going to provide what we feel very reasonable time to comply. We have done some inspections to date, and most of the corrective actions are something fairly simple, as there's vegetation in front of a control structure, debris. We haven't come across any that what I would characterize as very expensive or anything like that at this time yet. So. Then also wanted to say the penalty just refers to our current code enforcement ordinance as well. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Our intent is to bring this item forward to full council in the near future for first and second reading. So.
Lance, thank you very much. Council, any questions? Councilor Selburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What type of penalties would they face if corrections weren't made?
With the reference to our current code enforcement ordinance, it's the $100, $200 per day penalty. So each day, that it just refers to that current existing code enforcement ordinance.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilor Starr?
Thank you. Lance, the first impression, it looks like this is something we need to be doing, and as all things, it's nice to have the time to take a look at this as we move forward. Are you anticipating any additional staffing that would be required through our normal enforcement process? Do we have the staff in place to do the type of enforcement that you think would be needed?
We have been inspecting. The short answer is no. We looked at other communities, and they had much more, I guess, elaborate programs with self-reporting and things like that. Especially with this first time around, we feel that we would just rather have a staff member on site and likely walk through that with the owner to educate them about this. So in the past, we've done inspections in the past, but there hasn't been an explicit ordinance for enforcement if that action isn't taken.
Well, I agree with you 100% that education is going to be a big part of this, and I think that we try to do as much education in all our code enforcement as part of just solving the problem rather than having to go to a formal enforcement process. So I appreciate that there's an opportunity for people to do the right thing and to move forward. The other thing, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair, if I can do one more. I didn't see anything from the health department as part of the background in this with is there any maybe concerns from that department? I think of mosquitoes and the totally lost it. I apologize. Yeah, critters. Thank you for sharing. But just that I guess there wouldn't be any more issues with mosquitoes or West Nile is what I was trying to come up with. Thank you. In those kind of treatments, that it seems like there would be the possibility for more standing water, whether it's, like I said, with mosquitoes or the critters, as my fellow counselors have encouraged me to say. So.
The health department certainly keeps close eye on our public BMPs, but these private ones are on private property, and as such, it'd be that landowner's responsibility to do that. Now, if we come across something that if it's appropriate, we'll certainly include the health department. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Councilor Staley.
Lance, how many of these this thing you had the map there? How many were there on the map?
When I queried it in our GIS program, it was roughly 354 sites.
And how many are you planning on having a rotation? Everybody gets inspected every 2 years, every year, every what?
As many of these are approaching 10 years, I would say I would expect to get through 60 a year potentially and be right around maybe a 5-year rotational basis. We are planning on doing random inspections. That way, one entity, one developer, if they have multiple properties, doesn't feel like we're just focusing on him. We're looking at them all over the community, but certainly if our staff are aware of something that is obvious in need of maintenance, we'll certainly direct our attention to that as well.
Well, okay, and so coming back to Councilor Starr's question, is this going to require that we hire another staff member, or are you going to be able to absorb this within the department that's already doing it?
At this point, we're not anticipating any additional FTE needs.
Okay, any other questions? Then, Lance, thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank you because you did present before land use here a month back, and we had suggestions, and you took those suggestions and you've incorporated them into the ordinance. So for that, I thank you for listening and acting. So thank you very much.
I need to share that with the other team members that helped draft this ordinance as well. So, we had Diane Best with the city attorney's office, and of course Andy Berger, stormwater manager as well. So.
But you're standing at the podium now, so you should probably take the majority of the credit. So, but anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it very much. Well, next, just a reminder to the public that next Tuesday is one of our rare Tuesdays off from city council meetings. So counselors enjoy that day off. And also this coming Thursday is Thanksgiving. We definitely do have a lot to be thankful for. I know that oftentimes the focus seems to be on the meal, but the focus should be on the many benefits that we have received over the last year, as well as the individuals we're sharing that meal with. So a very happy Thanksgiving to my fellow counselors and to the citizens of Sioux Falls. With that being said, this meeting is adjourned.